In today's talk on our series on how to optimize heart rate variability, we're going to be talking about behavior change. Behavior change, in my opinion, is really a foundational pillar, especially when it comes to optimizing heart rate variability and in turn your health. Regardless of the goal that you might have in health, wellness, or really life in general, there needs to be some type of behavior change that's facilitated. Now, we could talk about this topic for hours, but what we're going to do today is just lay out a simple framework for behavior change and review some practical strategies on how you can optimize and make the most of trying to change a behavior. So, firstly, let's start with the fact that change is difficult, right? This is something that we all know, and that's why this presentation is so important. So, the reason that change is so difficult is because there's always two independent systems that are at play. Firstly, you have your rational brain, right? This is your logic, the things that you very easily think out, your information, your ideas, your reasoning. And then on the other side of the equation, you have your ever important emotional brain. So these are the things that operate a little bit in the background, and I'm sure we've all experienced this as well. These are the things that operate on autopilot that may dictate what our motivation is, what are the cravings that we might have, all those type of things. So in an ideal world, these two systems are working together to execute on a goal or a behavior change, when in reality, we know that unfortunately these two systems are always battling one another. So this is really the difference between knowing that you should do something, knowing that something's important, and actually following through on that, the practical piece of that. So this is a very important concept here that I wanted to note, is the idea that the mindset that you have and the way that your brain is, the way that you think is not fixed, right? So you can train your brain and your mindset, your behaviors, just like you can train the body. So that's what we're doing here with some of these strategies so I want you to really think about this concept of being able to train your brain. So the best framework for behavior change comes from a social psychologist, and Jonathan Haidt. He proposed this three-part system, and I think it paints the best picture, the best understanding of what needs to go into facilitating behavior change. So firstly, imagine this analogy: a rider on an elephant going down a path, and at the end of that path is your successful behavior change. Okay, so again, three parts. The first part is the rider on the elephant. This is your rational system. Okay, the elephant, the underrated player here in this equation, is the emotional system. And then the path that you're going down is the environment. So these are all the things surrounding your goal, your obstacles that may come up. So when we talk about this analogy, the most important thing is that we need all three of these elements to be addressed in order to facilitate not only a behavior change, but a sustainable behavior change that's going to stick long term. So if we think about this analogy, if we don't address any of these elements, if we don't address the rider, if we don't direct the rider where to go, it's not going to appropriately dictate the direction of the elephant. Okay? If the elephant isn't motivated to move, if we haven't addressed motivation, which we'll talk about, also not going to get to the end of that path. And if we haven't shaped the path accordingly, if we haven't cleared as many obstacles or things that may come up to get in our way as possible, also not going to get to the end of that path, and in turn your behavior change. So let's break each of these down. First, let's go over directing the rider. So this is correlated with, again, your rational brain. And what this really comes down to is creating clarity and appropriate goal setting. So I'm sure you've heard the acronym before, SMART goals, but what we're trying to do here is just best plan accordingly around our goals. Okay, so the best framework for this comes from a lot of the stuff that precision nutrition does, which is basically the idea of breaking an overarching goal that you have, right, an outcome goal, down into the processes, skills, and habits that you need to do on a consistent basis, right? So the example of having a goal of wanting to lose 10 to 15 pounds in the next few months is great, but it's really important to break that down as much as possible into what do you need to do on a weekly basis? What do you need to do on a daily basis that's going to get you towards that goal? Kind of branching off of that, this is incredibly important, and one of the most important takeaways I think from today is to really do one thing at a time. I'm sure you've heard it before, but skip the overhaul method where we try and change too many things at once. We try and change everything. We get to a point where we're frustrated. But the reality is that this is just not how the brain operates. This is not how we change, right? The brain is not very receptive to that. If we also think about this in terms of motivation, when we're not successful because we've tried to change too much, this can be a real killer to our motivation. So I think it's really important to just focus on one element at a time, one skill, one thing that you're trying to change, and let that build traction going forward. Nextly is something that's seemingly obvious, but that I want to take the time to note and point out is starting with the inside of this circle, right? We always want to go from the inside out with these type of analogies. Only focus on the things that you can control. Only focus on the things that you can actually influence or control. We spend far too much energy on the things that are outside of our influence or outside of our control. Again, seemingly obvious, but really important to note. So what can you actually control? Again, seemingly obvious, but you can control yourself. You have the ability to control what I call your APE. So that's your A is for your attitude and your appearance. P is for your positive self-talk, your present moment focus, your process, your preparation. E is going to be for your effort, your energy, your emotions. All of these things are within your control and all things that you can work on. So, promoting good self-talk and promoting the right mindset for yourself is something that you really have control over that's going to help dictate a lot of the behavior change that you're trying to go about and can be very, very powerful. So breaking off of the concept of taking an overarching goal and breaking it down into processes, I often have clients create a daily checklist of 3 to 5 behaviors or tasks that need to be done each day towards their goal or change. And this is a really, really important concept. It, again, creates clarity of what it is that you need to do on an individual day-to-day basis. Okay. And when you do this, when you check the box of accomplishing these things, you're releasing a chemical called dopamine, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. An app that I often have clients download is called Habit Bowl. It's a really great daily goal tracker, just a really great way to organize the goals that you have, get regular reminders about them, and have them all in one place. Another thing I often give to clients is this example of the compound effect. And this is a really great representation of the impact of the things that you do on a day-to-day basis, those small individual decisions, checking those boxes, and how they build traction over time to really end up leading to that radical change in our life that we're going for. So, it's the difference between instant gratification and delayed gratification, right? Too often we want the success right away. We want what we want, right? But if we use this analogy, would you rather have a check for $3 million right now or a penny that doubles every day for a month? And at the end of that month, you end up with almost $11 million. So again, just a really great representation of how consistency with doing things on a day-to-day basis over time is really what's going to create radical differences and radical changes in your life. So nextly, let's talk about the ever important motivational piece. We'll talk about motivating the elephant, okay? The elephant in the room, pun intended. So what we're doing here is we're trying to create motivation, the deep-rooted motivation. We're trying to create and figure out what is your driving force, what is your desire, okay? So the most important concept with motivation is that you don't have to feel motivated to get started, right? It's a decision that you make, and the motivation can come later down the line. So I think too often people wait for some overwhelming amount of motivation to just carry us and take us through. And that doesn't always happen. But again, it's a decision that we can make to get started, to just start to build traction, do that one thing. And the motivation can come later down the line, especially as you start to check some of those boxes. And this is just a great quote for that. You don't have to be great to start, but you have to start to be great, right? So this concept of figuring out what your deep-rooted motivation is, figuring out what your why is. And this comes from Simon Sinek, who wrote the book Start With Why. And this is a really, really important concept. And the reason is that when you figure out what your why is and you tie your goals to that why, you're tapping into what we call your limbic brain. And this is basically your emotional epicenter. So those things that operate on autopilot that we talked about, your cravings, all of those things are going to be dictated by your limbic brain. So the more that we can address that limbic brain, via way of figuring out what our why is, the better success that we're going to have. And that's really what's going to keep us going and keep us committed to our behavior change. Another important distinction to make when you're setting goals is the difference between an intrinsic goal and an extrinsic goal. So extrinsic goals are things that tend to be centered around things that are a little more superficial, right? So money, social status, prizes, anything along those lines. Whereas your intrinsic goals tend to be more of the things centered around your self-worth, your passion, things surrounding your family. And these are really more deep-rooted reasons. And they're really things that we want to focus on because they're going to be the things that keep us going, again, when the going gets tough. Another really cool thing that you can do from a motivational standpoint is to create a vision board. So once you've figured out what that deep-rooted why is, right, you've asked yourself, why do I want to lose this weight? Why do I want to accomplish this goal? And you continue to ask why. Once you've figured out what that is, this vision board is a great way to build an identity around that, to build confidence around that. And what you're doing here is you're just picking pictures, quotes, anything that relates to that deep-rooted why, putting it all together on a board, and then you're posting it somewhere, in your house or at work, somewhere where you're going to see it on a day-to-day basis, hopefully multiple times a day, just as a continual reminder of what's really important. So we talked about this chemical dopamine a few minutes ago. And basically this is a positive, what we call neurotransmitter in the brain, a positive brain chemical. And it ties very closely with motivation. So what happens when we check the box, so when we accomplish something, even if it's something on a day-to-day basis, when we check that box, we're getting a release of this chemical called dopamine, which is going to trigger motivation. And it's a really great chemical to optimize to build traction for our goals. So another important concept comes from a quote here from Peter Drucker, which I love, is what gets measured gets managed. So if you're not having some type of objective measurement, some type of, again, smart goal, right? Something that creates clarity, it's going to be very hard to manage that goal and to stay on the path towards it. Another really, really important concept here, building off of that chemical of dopamine, is to celebrate your success, right? Celebrate the small wins. You made it to the gym when you didn't want to on that particular day. You skipped out on the meal that you shouldn't have. I think too often we're way too hard on ourselves, and this perpetuates a lot of the difficulty around behavior change. So celebrate those small wins, the things that you're successful with on a day-to-day basis, and they'll really benefit you building traction in the future. So the last element here in this analogy is shaping the path. So what we're trying to do here is make it as easy as possible to succeed, create the most optimal environment for change. So again, just making it convenient to do right and inconvenient to do wrong. So this is the difference between not having junk food in the house and having junk food in the house, right? You may still drive out to get that junk food if you really want it, but you're much less likely if it's not in the house. So the most important concept when it comes to shaping your environment and setting yourself up to succeed is this idea of the habit loop. So basically, this is basically understanding how habits form, and in turn, how you can formulate a new habit or break an old habit. So basically, with a habit, what happens is we have a particular cue, right? In this example that's shown here, it's stress, right? The person is under stress. What we're aiming for is some type of reward at the end, right? So in this case, it's feeling relaxed, feeling less stressed. And then in the middle of that, we have the routine that brings us to that reward. When we are trying to formulate a new habit or break an old one, what you want to do is keep the cue the same, right? Because those things aren't really going to change. You're still going to be potentially stressed. Life is going to happen. Things are going to come up. The reward is fine, right? There's nothing wrong with wanting to feel relaxed, at ease. What we're going to do is insert a new routine gradually and progressively. So in this case, the routine previously was having a glass of wine. Maybe we're going to try and gradually decrease the amount of that wine. And then we're going to maybe try and insert a new routine where that after the cue comes and we're trying to get the reward of relaxing, we're inserting a new routine of maybe just talking with an old friend. So next concept here is the idea of accountability partners, right? So almost nothing worth accomplishing can be done alone. So basically what an accountability partner is just people that you tell about your goals. And just as the name suggests, they can check in with you, help keep you accountable. The more people that you tell about your goals, the less you're going to not want to let people down. So tell friends, family members, colleagues, the more people you tell about the goals that you have, the better. So as we go in review here, really important to note that sustainable behavior change requires us to address all three of these elements that we talked about. So you have to direct the rider by creating the appropriate goals. You have to figure out what the deep-rooted motivation is to motivate and move that elephant. And you have to shape the path accordingly via way of habits and your environment. So what are your practical takeaways? Again, remember that you must address both the rational and emotional brain when making a change in behavior. When setting goals, break them down as much as possible. Break them down into process goals. Take the time to figure out what your deep-rooted motivation behind your goals are and make them, again, more intrinsic, more deep-rooted, tied in with the things that are important. Plan, right? So make it easier to succeed and harder to fail. Be sure to take advantage of that chemical of dopamine by tracking your progress and celebrating those small wins. Only focus on changing one thing at a time. Remember that compound effect over time. Utilize the power of retraining a habit through the cue and reward loop. And then lastly, have multiple accountability partners and people that you tell about your goals. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, I am the owner of a recently formed brand called Proactive Health and Wellness. I am a licensed massage therapist in New York, Connecticut, and Florida. I am a strength coach and personal trainer, and I am a certified sleep coach as well as a certified health coach. But really above all else, I am a healthcare practitioner who firmly believes in a proactive and preventative approach to managing your own health and your own well-being via way of lifestyle modifications. So the reason that Proactive Health and Wellness was formed was really centered around education and empowerment. So I love this quote from Nelson Mandela, which education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And I firmly believe that. So the goal with my company and brand is to really provide as much tangible, practical education and information for people pertaining to how they can manage their own health as possible. So something else that I do is, again, in the lines of sleep and how undersold that I think sleep is in the equation. I do a lot of sleep coaching and consulting. I use principles of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is now the first line of treatment for those with insomnia in place of sleeping pills. So the brand that I have is kind of a subdivision here. It's called the Online Sleep Coach. So really what I'm trying to do here is just bring, again, more awareness to sleep and how important it is in health and wellness, how it should be just as important as, exercise and nutrition in terms of how we focus on it and how we coach it. So where to find me and reach me? My email for my Proactive Health and Wellness brand is proactivehealthandwellness1@gmail.com. And then online sleep coach at Gmail for sleep coaching stuff specifically. And then here's just websites and then where you can find me on Instagram as well.